The summer sun hung over Flaxborough with that particular brightness, which makes small towns seem unnaturally clean, as if each stone in the marketplace had been polished by its own self-importance. At the Guildhall, banners fluttered in the mild wind, announcing the annual summer art exhibition. Residents, all dressed in their polite best, filtered in, exchanging the usual greetings, some perfunctory, some smothered in barely restrained judgment. Inspector Purbright, who had arrived earlier than necessary, leaned slightly against a wooden banister, observing the quiet stir. The Guildhall smelled faintly of varnish and boiled linseed oil, mingling with the faint aroma of over-ambitious floral displays in the corner. Purbright, though ostensibly attending as a courteous townsperson, had an acute eye for the peculiar, which often went unnoticed by those more eager to admire the daubs of colour rather than their subtle intentions. Most of the displayed works were safely forgettable, landscapes of the river with more enthusiasm than skill, portraits of local dignitaries painted with careful blandness, and abstract shapes that seemed to exist solely to justify the artist's existence. Yet in the north corner of the hall, behind a velvet rope, hung a small canvas that made the polite murmuring of the crowd change tone ever so slightly. It was a portrait of Mrs. Elspeth Purdy, the town's florist and perennial participant in the Guildhall's social calendar. Her face, accurately depicted, was nonetheless disquieting. There was a tension in the eyes that Purbright found curious. They were not quite her eyes. Perhaps it was the tilt of the head, or the peculiar way the artist had chosen to light the cheeks, but something about them seemed borrowed, almost secretive. Mrs. Purdy herself hovered nearby, unaware of the scrutiny, fussing with her gloves as though she could smooth over any imperfections, real or imagined. "Ah, Inspector," said the artist, Mr. Benedict Frampton, bowing with a certain theatrical flair that suggested both pride and nervousness. "I hope the work meets with your approval." Purbright inclined his head politely. "It is memorable, Mr. Frampton. One notices certain peculiarities." "Oh?" The artist's brow lifted. "I trust nothing is amiss." "Merely observation," Purbright murmured, his voice soft but deliberate. "One must look closely at what one sees, yes?" Nearby, a cluster of gossiping matrons began their low chatter, voices dripping with gentle accusation, speculation, and self-importance. "Did you see the eyes?" whispered one, clutching a parasol. "I thought they were too sharp, almost." "Cunning, cunning?" her companion echoed, in a tone that suggested horror had only just dawned upon her. "Oh, Elspeth herself? Surely you jest." "Why, that is impossible." Purbright let the murmurs wash over him, noting that the townsfolk's minds, once alerted, were already weaving stories far more intricate than the simple act of painting. Mrs. Purdy smiled, aware that the attention was not entirely flattering, but pleased nonetheless, and a faint crimson rose in her cheeks. He made a mental note. Small blushes were often the softest witnesses to hidden unease. The exhibition continued in its polite chaos, and as the crowd moved on to more familiar works, a still life of apples in a copper bowl, a landscape that proudly boasted the local windmill, Purbright returned his gaze to the portrait. He observed a faint imperfection in the brushwork near the right eye, almost invisible, yet not accidental. A subtle smear, as if the artist had paused mid-thought, or perhaps been distracted. It was the sort of detail that might suggest nothing at all to the casual observer. But to Purbright, it hinted at curiosity, secrecy, or something left unsaid. And it was this whisper of an anomaly that often proved more telling than the overt. He would, in due course, investigate, not with fanfare, but with patient inquiry. By the time the exhibition closed, the whispers had travelled half the town, already embroidered with suspicions, imagined slights and potential scandals. The seeds were planted quietly, and Purbright, notebook unopened, left with the faintest lift in his shoulders, a signal, to himself at least, that something unusual was afoot, and that, as always, the devil resided in the details the town preferred not to notice. By the following morning, Flaxborough had become a small, roiling cauldron of curiosity and conjecture. The Guildhall's summer exhibition, though now closed, lingered in conversation like an uninvited guest at breakfast tables, tea-urns and shop counters. Every glance, every comment seemed charged with the potential for judgment or revelation. At Miss Trelawney's bakery, the scent of fresh bread mingled with murmurs of the portrait. "I swear it was the eyes," she said to Mrs. Gillingham, her flour-dusted hands folded primly on the counter. "So sharp, so knowing. One could feel them following you across the hall." Mrs. Gillingham, whose primary concern was social propriety, clutched her teacup tightly. "Nonsense," she replied, though her eyes darted toward the window, as if ensuring the neighbours had not overheard. "Elspeth would never tolerate impropriety. You know how she guards her reputation." The word reputation had the curious effect of further stoking interest. Soon, in the market square, conversations were framed around subtle suppositions. Mr. Harrow, the retired magistrate, leaned on his cane as he addressed a small audience near the fountain. "The work is fine, technically speaking, but there is a tension about it. One wonders whether the artist glimpsed something the subject herself prefers hidden." Children, oblivious to these machinations, played near the fountain, yet even they paused as though attuned to the town's unease, their laughter softened by the serious expressions of their elders. Purbright, walking through the square on his early rounds, noted the rhythm of whispers, the way statements were polished and exaggerated as they passed from mouth to mouth. A minor observation, yet he knew the machinery of small-town opinion often mattered as much as facts in guiding human behaviour. The florist herself, Mrs. Purdy, seemed untroubled in public. She greeted patrons with her usual warmth, the slight blush on her cheeks dismissed as residual pride. Yet in the corners of the town's cafes people speculated about her composure. "I noticed her hands," said a clerk at the general store, "slightly trembling. Perhaps she dislikes the portrayal more than she admits." Meanwhile, Mr. Frampton, the artist, revelled in the subtle turbulence. He circulated carefully among acquaintances, offering polite explanations about technique, brushwork, and lighting, yet never missing the chance to let curiosity hang tantalizingly in the air. He knew well that minor ambiguity could create fascination far beyond mere skill. By mid-morning, the post office was rife with conversation. Letters mentioning the portrait had already been delivered to absent acquaintances. Mr. Hobb, the postmaster, recounted each in his habitual monotone, though his eyes twinkled as he repeated phrases like, "so lifelike it unsettled me," and "those eyes," something borrowed. Perhaps each story, slightly altered, contributed to a growing aura of mystery that had little to do with the reality of the painting itself. Purbright observed all of this from the window of his office. He made a few notes, not about the gossip itself, but about the tendencies it revealed, which townsfolk were inclined toward exaggeration, which clutched at propriety, and which seemed driven by subtle envy. These were the small levers that moved Flaxborough, the undercurrents beneath polite conversation. By evening, even the vicar, Reverend Meeks, found himself embroiled in discussions of the portrait's curious nature. During tea with the ladies of the parish, he remarked delicately, "There is a certain intensity, isn't there? I cannot say why, but one feels a story behind the work, perhaps more so than behind the subject herself." It was precisely this impression of hidden depth that stirred Purbright's mind. He understood that in Flaxborough, intrigue rarely erupted with fanfare. It seeped gradually into polite conversation, creating a lattice of speculation that could prove more instructive than any confession. The townsfolk, unwittingly, had begun constructing a narrative from fragments, each piece slightly skewed by pride, jealousy, or habit. As night fell and gas lamps flickered along the streets, the inspector's quiet satisfaction grew. The portrait had done its work beyond the canvas. It had unsettled the ordinary, invited scrutiny, and begun to reveal fissures in otherwise seamless facades. In the days to come, he would unravel these fissures carefully, one subtle thread at a time, but for now, he allowed the town to chatter. For in Flaxborough, gossip was the most revealing crime scene of all. Purbright began his inquiries the following morning with a measured approach, visiting the Guildhall once more while the hall was quiet, the echoes of the exhibition still lingering in the varnished wood and polished floors. He found Mr. Frampton arranging his brushes and palettes with meticulous care, the artist's fingers dusted faintly with ochre and burnt sienna. "Inspector," Frampton said, bowing slightly, "I trust you found the exhibition satisfactory?" "Indeed," Purbright replied, his tone courteous but edged with gentle scrutiny. "There is a certain tension in your work that I find intriguing." Frampton smiled, a twitch at the corner of his mouth suggesting both pleasure and unease. "Tension is an artist's constant companion," he said, "though I assure you it is rarely intended to unsettle the subject." "I am aware," Purbright said, studying the arrangement of the canvases. "Yet one notices subtleties, accidental or otherwise. It is in these details that character often hides." He then met with Mrs. Purdy in her flower shop. The scent of roses and lilies filled the air as she guided him past the blooms, hands still slightly red from morning pruning. "I confess," she said, carefully arranging a bouquet of carnations. The portrait caused a small stir. "People are quite talkative," Purbright inclined his head. "Talk is a useful thing, Mrs. Purdy. Often it reveals what facts alone cannot. Did you feel uncomfortable with the depiction?" Her eyes flickered for the briefest instant, a small hesitation unnoticed by anyone else. Not exactly uncomfortable, or perhaps exposed in ways one does not expect. He noted the choice of words, the gentle admission that beneath her polished composure there was a trace of disquiet. As they spoke, he observed the shop assistant, a young girl who busied herself but occasionally glanced at the two with quiet curiosity. A witness to subtleties she scarcely understood. Next, Purbright called on the exhibition's curator, Miss Aldridge, a woman whose reputation for precision was well known. She led him through the hall once more, describing the selection process and the placement of the artworks with an almost scholarly zeal. "It is unusual," she admitted quietly, "for a portrait to provoke such commentary. Usually only scandal or technical error does that." "Indeed," Purbright said. "Yet technical perfection often obscures character. The subtle divergences, the slight hesitations in execution, these are the telling features." He returned later to the Guildhall, where a few residents lingered, ostensibly to admire other pieces, but in fact observing reactions and recounting whispered conversations from the previous day. A retired schoolmaster, Mr. Grindle, spoke at length about the compositional choices in Frampton's work, interweaving casual observations with gentle criticism. Purbright listened patiently, interjecting only when a contradiction or notable detail arose, prompting the speaker to clarify without embarrassment. By afternoon, the inspector had gathered fragments of narrative, each coloured by the teller's personality and small-town prejudices. One claimed the eyes in the portrait were almost imperious, another that they betrayed a secret the subject herself would not admit. Even minor details, such as the tilt of a hand or the curl of a collar, were amplified into subtle indicators of character. Purbright noted every nuance, every fleeting hesitation, the quiet signs that suggested more than mere artistic interpretation. As he stepped outside into the late sun, he allowed himself a moment of reflection. The town, he thought, was already constructing a complex story from a few brushstrokes and polite smiles. His task would be to untangle what was imagined from what was real, to follow the trail of human behavior rather than rely on obvious evidence. The initial inquiries, as he had expected, revealed little of certainty. Yet they had exposed patterns, inconsistencies, and small, telling details, threads that would later prove crucial. In Flaxborough, the truth was rarely declared openly. It whispered, hinted, and emerged only when one knew precisely where to look. Purbright had begun to see the faint outlines of that hidden story, and he knew patience, as always, would be his most valuable tool. Late that afternoon, the quiet equilibrium of Flaxborough's social life was briefly unsettled by the arrival of a visitor. He was a gentleman of modest stature, yet his presence carried a curious authority, as though the very act of entering a room demanded attention. Introduced as Mr. Archibald Vasey, an art critic from London, he was welcomed with polite courtesy by the Guildhall Committee, though whispers quickly followed him across the hall. Purbright observed from a discreet distance as Vasey moved deliberately among the portraits, his eyes narrowing at certain details, pausing with a precise and slightly theatrical deliberation. He lingered before Mrs. Purdy's portrait, inspecting the brushwork, the shading, the tilt of her head. Occasionally he murmured to himself a barely audible commentary, yet the effect on the town's residents was palpable. Every pause, every muttered phrase seemed laden with meaning. Mrs. Purdy, ever composed, maintained a polite smile, though her fingers twisted the edge of a glove with subtle tension. She was clearly aware of the scrutiny, though she attempted to project unaffected ease. Mr. Frampton, meanwhile, hovered close enough to overhear, yet careful to maintain his own dignified composure. The artist's pride and unease mingled as he watched the critic's expression shift subtly, never fully revealing approval nor disapproval. A small group of residents gathered nearby, whispering among themselves. "I believe he admires it," said one, though her voice carried a tremor of uncertainty. "Or perhaps he finds some flaw we cannot perceive." "Flaw?" countered another, a retired solicitor with a keen eye for minor technicalities. "I think he is searching for something hidden." Purbright noted the way the crowd interpreted Vasey's neutral demeanor as evidence of hidden judgment. It was a familiar pattern. The presence of an outsider, even one of polite authority, magnified small insecurities and unspoken rivalries. Vasey eventually approached Purbright, bowing slightly. "Inspector, I trust I'm not intruding on private matters?" His voice was courteous, yet carried a subtle insistence that implied expectation. "Not at all," Purbright replied, observing the slight twitch in the critic's gaze as it swept over the assembled residents. "I was merely appreciating the attention the exhibition has drawn." "Attention? Yes," Vasey murmured, inclining his head toward the portrait. "But it is remarkable how a simple work can evoke such reactions. One wonders whether the sitter herself realizes the effect she produces." Mrs. Purdy's lips pressed into a thin line, the faintest shift in color across her cheeks betraying a mixture of pride and unease. Purbright, ever discreet, took note of the almost imperceptible signs, the tiny gestures that spoke volumes, a hand brushing against a sleeve, a subtle adjustment of posture, a momentary hesitation in eye contact as the afternoon wore on. Vasey moved to other works, leaving behind a trail of speculation. The townsfolk discussed his comments in hushed tones, debating whether he had uncovered a hidden meaning, critiqued a minor imperfection, or merely indulged in polite theatrics. Small rivalries surfaced, each observer eager to assert their own interpretation, often embellishing or contradicting their neighbor's conclusions. Purbright, reflecting on the dynamics, recognized the value of such a visit. An outsider's presence disrupted routine complacency, eliciting reactions otherwise concealed, and in so doing, revealed human character more clearly than direct interrogation ever could. By evening, Vasey departed, leaving the town buzzing with conjecture. Mrs. Purdy returned to her shop, carefully arranging roses and dahlias, yet her hands trembled slightly, a subtle indication that the critic's visit had affected her more than she allowed. Mr. Frampton packed his materials with precise care, silently pleased at the stir his work had caused. while the townsfolk lingered in conversation, analysing every gesture, every word, as though the critic had spoken in riddles meant only for them. Purbright, walking back through the quiet streets, reflected on the day's observations. The pattern was familiar. Ordinary lives unsettled by small intrusions, the unspoken revealed in the briefest moments of attention. It was precisely in such moments, he knew, that the path to understanding emerged, delicate, subtle, and entirely human. By midweek, the town's polite chatter had coalesced into something approaching suspicion, and Purbright observed the first clear candidate for casual accusation. It was Mr. Clive Danvers, a town councillor whose precise suits and fastidious moustache had long marked him as a man devoted to order and propriety. Among certain residents, the whispered suggestion had already taken root. If any impropriety existed in relation to the portrait, surely it would have a connection to Danvers. The councillor was called to the Guildhall ostensibly to oversee a minor repair to the exhibition space. But the timing, in the eyes of the town, seemed suggestive. He arrived promptly, clipboard in hand, moving with measured steps, yet every gesture appeared scrutinized under invisible lenses. Some claimed to have seen his eyes linger a moment too long on Mrs. Purdy's portrait, though it was impossible to tell whether observation or idle curiosity motivated him. Purbright met Danvers near the central staircase, offering a polite greeting. "Good afternoon, Mr. Danvers. I trust your morning has been agreeable." "Most agreeable, Inspector," Danvers replied, inclining his head with practiced civility. "Though I confess the exhibition continues to inspire varied interpretations among the townsfolk." "Indeed," Purbright said, noting the subtle tension in Danvers's fingers as he adjusted his watch. "It seems minor matters are often magnified in small towns. Perhaps we are fortunate that the stirring is limited to conversation and conjecture." Danvers smiled, though his eyes betrayed the faintest flicker of impatience. "Naturally. Still, one must guard against misunderstanding, particularly when reputations are at stake. A misjudgment could prove inconvenient." The words, deliberate yet casually spoken, caught Purbright's attention. They suggested a man aware of possible consequences, yet careful to phrase his caution as general principle rather than personal concern. Purbright made a subtle mental note. Danvers's vigilance might reflect propriety, anxiety, or, less obviously, knowledge of something he preferred remain hidden. Later, Purbright observed the councillor conversing with a small circle of acquaintances in the market square. Danvers spoke of municipal matters, the garden committee, and the upcoming council meeting, yet every so often his gaze shifted back toward the painting in the Guildhall, as though the work occupied more of his attention than his words suggested. Whispers among neighbours amplified this interpretation. A raised eyebrow here, a slight hesitation there, transformed into imagined intrigue in the retelling. That evening, Purbright visited Danvers at his residence under the pretence of casual courtesy. The house was impeccably maintained, with polished wood and carefully arranged books, reflecting a life devoted to order. Danvers offered tea, and the conversation remained formally polite, yet Purbright noticed the subtle tightness in the councillor's jaw, the slight avoidance of eye contact when the portrait was mentioned indirectly. "I understand the exhibition has caused discussion," Purbright said gently, stirring his tea. "Some have suggested interpretations beyond mere artistry." Danvers inclined his head, lips pressing briefly into a line. "Discussion is inevitable, but interpretation, Inspector, can be wildly subjective. One ought not to read more than exists in plain sight." "Of course," Purbright replied, voice even noting the careful emphasis on subjectivity. "Yet it is often what is unspoken that reveals character most clearly." Danvers hesitated, then laughed softly, a sound intended to dispel tension, but tinged with unease. "You are too discerning, Inspector. I assure you there is nothing more here than meets the eye." As Purbright departed, he allowed himself a small inward smile. Danvers, like most townsfolk, presented a composed surface, yet the tiniest ripple betrayed interest, concern, or possibly something more complex. For the moment, however, the councillor remained merely a candidate for suspicion. The first threads were in place, and Purbright would observe quietly, allowing the town to act as its own amplifier before any final judgment could be formed. It was a minor detail that first caught Purbright's attention, almost by accident during a second quiet visit to the Guildhall. While reviewing the placement of the canvases, he noticed that the small silver frame holding a sketch of the town bridge, otherwise ordinary, had a subtle scratch along its lower edge. It was the sort of imperfection easily overlooked, one that neither the curator nor the artist had remarked upon, yet Purbright's trained eye recognized it immediately as deliberate rather than incidental. The scratch was faint, but its position suggested it had occurred after the frame had been hung, not during manufacture or handling. Purbright considered the possibilities: a casual accident, a restless visitor, or perhaps a momentary irritation expressed through physical gesture. None of these seemed likely, yet the town's capacity for small, quiet mischief made each option plausible. He returned the following day to Mrs. Purdy's shop, ostensibly to inquire about a new shipment of roses, but his gaze wandered to the portrait again. He noticed a tiny irregularity in the shading of her left eye, something imperceptible at first glance. The iris, slightly asymmetrical, gave the impression of misalignment, not a flaw of technique, but a subtle hint that the artist had perhaps observed more than mere physical appearance. Purbright made a mental note, as these trivialities often served as the softest witnesses: minor scratches, slight variations in brushwork, faint hesitations in posture, each revealing tendencies, attention, or even concealed emotions. It was not evidence in the formal sense, yet it was precisely the type of clue that might lead to understanding in a town where overt confession was rare. He spoke briefly with Mr. Frampton, mentioning only the frame's scratch in passing. The artist adjusted his spectacles, frowning slightly. "Ah, I did notice that," he said, but the explanation was vague, framed as an accidental misplacement during installation. Purbright accepted the response, noting the careful phrasing, the absence of any spontaneous elaboration. In the town square, news of the portrait and the exhibition continued to simmer. Conversations had become more nuanced, observers now aware that something beyond the visual appeal had captured attention. The smallest gestures, the briefest pauses, and even mundane objects, the tilt of a hat, the displacement of a chair, the faint scratch on a frame, were magnified in significance, circulating through rumour and interpretation with surprising speed. Purbright, walking among the familiar streets, reflected on human nature as it played out in microcosm. It was often the trivial oddities, the tiny aberrations, that revealed intentions or preoccupations more clearly than declarations or arguments. In Flaxborough, subtlety was everything, and those who noticed only the overt often missed the truths quietly whispered by circumstance. That evening, as gas lamps cast long shadows across the cobbled streets, he returned to the Guildhall for one last inspection. The scratch, the slight asymmetry, the imperceptible hesitations in posture, all converged in his mind as soft signals pointing toward hidden currents in the town. To anyone else they were nothing. To Purbright they were threads waiting to be followed. He departed quietly, allowing the town to continue its chatter, knowing that the smallest observation might, in due course, illuminate the path to the larger story. Over the next several days, Purbright extended his observations beyond the original circle, allowing the town's broader social fabric to reveal itself. It began with Mrs. Pennington, a retired teacher who frequented the library and offered her opinions on local art with a stern, precise manner. She had attended the exhibition with a friend and, though outwardly polite, carried a quietly critical eye, noting the subtleties in shading and composition that others overlooked. Her remarks, when shared in conversation, carried enough authority to influence the interpretations of several acquaintances. Then there was Mr. Latham, the young journalist from the Flaxborough Gazette, eager to make his mark and uncommonly curious about minor intrigues. He began asking indirect questions about the portrait, the artist, and the sitter, probing politely but persistently. His inquiries, carefully phrased, revealed small contradictions in prior statements from townsfolk and hinted at rivalries that had long simmered beneath Flaxborough's genteel surface. Even shopkeepers, clerks, and the occasional passing visitor became unwitting participants. Each remark, each fleeting gesture, contributed to a web of information that Purbright mentally catalogued. A dislodged flower pot here, a comment about colour choice there, all became pieces of a larger puzzle. The inspector recognized that understanding character often required a wider field of observation than a single exhibition or conversation could provide. Meanwhile, Mrs. Purdy continued her work at the florist, attending to customers with poise. Yet subtle changes were apparent, a more careful positioning of her hands, an almost imperceptible tension in her smile, and occasional glances toward her portrait in the Guildhall. Even these minor behaviours were recorded by the town's informal network, and eventually they reached Purbright in fragmentary accounts, offering a richer understanding of her responses than any single meeting could yield. The expanding field also brought into focus small rivalries and concealed resentments. Mr. Danvers, the councillor, remained a figure of polite propriety, yet his habitual scrutiny of local events now seemed part of a broader pattern rather than isolated curiosity. Similarly, Mr. Frampton's pride in his craft was accompanied by subtle hints of sensitivity to critique, a combination that Purbright noted without immediate judgment. By observing the interplay of these individuals, the inspector began to discern the subtle hierarchies and tensions that governed Flaxborough society. It was not merely the portrait that had stirred interest, but the network of relationships, jealousies, and ambitions that it inadvertently illuminated. Even trivial details, like the manner in which a chair was replaced after conversation, or the direction of a head tilt when speaking to a neighbour, became indicative of deeper inclinations, of preferences and vulnerabilities that might otherwise remain invisible. Purbright's patience was rewarded in the quiet accumulation of these observations. He saw how the town's ordinary routines were now subtly guided by curiosity, how unspoken signals and small interactions suggested both motive and temperament. The network was intricate, yet coherent, and while no one might admit it, the collective behaviour of Flaxborough was revealing more than any single confession could. By the close of the week, Purbright had compiled a rich tapestry of character and circumstance. The field had expanded well beyond the exhibition itself, encompassing the town's social rhythms, minor alliances, and concealed frictions. Every triviality, every half-heard comment now formed part of a pattern, faint yet perceptible, which would soon guide the next steps in his inquiry. The picture was far from complete, but the outlines of human behaviour, quiet ambitions, and discreet tensions were taking shape with remarkable clarity. Flaxborough, usually so measured in its routines, experienced a subtle jolt the following Tuesday. The incident was neither loud nor dramatic, but it carried enough peculiarity to unsettle the careful rhythm of town life. A sketch, part of Mr. Frampton's preparatory studies for the exhibition, had vanished from the Guildhall, leaving only the faint impression of a displaced frame and a whisper of tension in the varnished air. Purbright arrived shortly after the discovery, noting immediately the arrangement of the remaining works. Nothing appeared disturbed, save for the absent sketch and a small indentation in the carpet where the frame had rested. The curator, Miss Aldridge, fussed quietly over the matter, her voice betraying restrained concern. "It is most irregular," she said, adjusting a velvet rope that had slipped slightly. "Such items are normally secure, and there has been no breach to suggest deliberate removal." Yet the absence was undeniable. Residents who had attended the exhibition speculated freely, each weaving their own narrative. Some suggested petty theft, others imagined a concealed grievance or slight, a few even proposed that the sketch had been borrowed for private admiration and misplaced inadvertently. In every conversation, the missing sketch became a symbol of hidden motives and quiet tensions. Purbright observed the reactions carefully, noting who expressed exaggerated alarm, who offered calm analysis, and who seemed unusually disinterested. Mr. Danvers, for instance, maintained an impeccable composure, but lingered longer than necessary by the display case, ostensibly to survey the other works. Mrs. Purdy, when questioned about her knowledge of the sketch, flushed faintly, her hands twisting the edge of a napkin, a minor telling gesture the inspector filed away. Even Mr. Frampton appeared affected. He examined the empty space with meticulous care, muttering softly about cataloguing errors and the importance of careful handling. Yet his precise concern carried a subtle undercurrent, a mix of pride, irritation, and perhaps unease over the implications of such an absence. Across town, the Gazette printed a cautious notice of the missing sketch, prompting a ripple of commentary that amplified minor observations into potential clues. Conversations at the post office, the bakery, and the markets were now tinged with speculation. Who had moved the sketch and why? Each person, consciously or not, became part of the web, their opinions refracted through their own biases and curiosities. Purbright, having examined the scene, made no public remark. He recorded the indentation, noted fingerprints carefully, and observed the position of adjacent artworks. Nothing suggested hasty or clumsy interference. The removal had been deliberate, measured and performed with knowledge of the hall's layout. Yet the absence alone, trivial as it might seem to some, shifted the focus. The first suspect, Mr. Danvers, remained under quiet scrutiny, but the missing sketch suggested that others, perhaps previously unnoticed, might be involved. By evening, the incident had subtly altered the town's equilibrium. Conversations were now tinged with a hint of tension previously absent, and the residents' interactions revealed layers of cautious observation. Purbright, reflecting on the day's developments, recognized the value of this minor disturbance. It forced new information into view, encouraged previously hidden behaviors to surface, and expanded the field of observation in ways that would prove essential in the days to follow. Late that evening, Purbright returned to his modest office, the quiet of the town settling around him like a well-worn coat. He placed his hat on the rack, removed his coat, and sank into the familiar leather chair, the soft creak of its springs accompanying his thoughts. The sketch, the subtle scratch on the frame, the borrowed eyes of Mrs. Purdy's portrait, all these trifles converged in his mind, forming a lattice of observation that required careful contemplation. He considered the nature of small-town behavior, how civility often masked minor resentments, how the meticulous cultivation of reputation could conceal both pride and fear, and how even the most trivial gesture could betray hidden preoccupations. In Flaxborough, ordinary actions were never entirely devoid of intention. A displaced chair, a slight flush, a fleeting glance could reveal more than prolonged conversation. Purbright reflected on human motives, the quiet drives that prompted people to act in ways both subtle and significant. Mrs. Purdy, outwardly composed, exhibited signs of unease. Mr. Danvers, disciplined and precise, held his attention in a way that suggested restrained concern. Mr. Frampton's artistry hinted at more than technical skill. It carried the imprint of observation, curiosity, and perhaps amusement. Each individual's behavior, even the smallest nuance, offered a window into character, yet required careful interpretation. He thought of the second incident, the missing sketch, and its implications. Such a deliberate action, measured and precise, could not be random. Someone had chosen to remove it, knowing the impact it would have on both the exhibition and the town's attention. But who, and to what end? Purbright allowed himself no rush to conclusion, understanding that the truest revelations often emerged only through patient observation. The inspector's gaze settled on a small table where his notebook lay open, filled with marginalia, sketches, and impressions. He reviewed the details of gestures, expressions, and minor irregularities he had catalogued. Each observation, seemingly trivial alone, contributed to a growing map of intentions and reactions. In Flaxborough, it was often the accumulation of minor irregularities that illuminated the greater truth. Purbright sipped his tea, letting the warmth focus his thoughts. He considered the interconnectedness of the town's residents, the subtle hierarchies and the social dances that dictated behavior. Politeness and propriety, he mused, were often the perfect veil for ambition, jealousy, and curiosity. And in these quiet currents, the path to understanding lay waiting. As the night deepened, he allowed himself a faint satisfaction. The threads of observation were numerous but coherent. The town, with its ordinary routines and hidden fissures, had begun to reveal itself in a pattern that only patience and attentiveness could discern. By morning he would continue, guided not by conjecture, but by the careful interpretation of human behavior and the minutiae that carried more weight than words ever could. The following afternoon, Purbright arranged a quiet meeting at the Guildhall under the guise of reviewing preparations for a minor lecture on local art. He invited Mrs. Purdy, Mr. Frampton, and Mr. Danvers, requesting only that they attend for a brief discussion. The air was deliberately calm, the hall empty aside from the 3 participants and the inspector, whose measured movements suggested nothing of the purpose behind the gathering. As they gathered near the portrait, Purbright spoke of the exhibition, in general terms praising technique and noting the enthusiasm it had inspired among residents. He allowed his words to drift, careful to observe reactions rather than demand responses. Every glance, every micro-expression was catalogued with precision. Mrs. Purdy adjusted a glove, her fingers brushing lightly over the seam, while Danvers's eyes flicked momentarily toward the empty space where the missing sketch had hung. Purbright's test was subtle. He remarked casually on the sketch's absence, framing it as an innocent observation. "One might assume it was misplaced during rearrangement," he said, voice soft and unhurried. "Yet small irregularities have a way of revealing themselves, do they not?" There was a slight pause, the kind that only occurs when words have multiple interpretations. Mr. Frampton's brow furrowed imperceptibly, while Danvers shifted his stance, heels just barely scraping the floor. Mrs. Purdy's hand trembled slightly as she reached for a chair, her lips pressed into a thin line, betraying a flicker of unease that she did not acknowledge aloud. Purbright allowed the silence to stretch, observing each reaction without comment. He noted the fleeting hesitation in Danvers's eyes, the brief tightening of his jaw, and the minute reddening of Mrs. Purdy's cheeks. These small signals, almost imperceptible to anyone else, conveyed far more than speech. The test was not confrontation, but the gentle application of pressure through attention, curiosity, and polite observation. He then directed a question toward Frampton, casually inquiring whether any preparatory sketches had been misplaced or borrowed for private study. The artist replied smoothly, noting only cataloguing errors, yet the subtle emphasis, the pause before completing his sentence, suggested awareness beyond mere clerical concern. Purbright recorded the nuance without outward sign. By the end of the meeting, the participants had departed, leaving the inspector alone. He reviewed his mental notes, considering how each individual had responded to a carefully structured, non-threatening prompt. The test was not dramatic, yet it had accomplished its purpose to reveal instinct, unease, and attention to small truths under controlled conditions. Purbright allowed himself a quiet satisfaction. The threads of observation, accumulated over days of careful attention, had begun to coalesce. The town's minor irregularities, gestures, and hesitations now formed a coherent pattern, pointing toward a truth not yet articulated, but quietly observable to one who knew where and how to look. The stage was set, and the resolution, when it came, would arrive with the calm precision characteristic of Flaxborough itself. Purbright called for a quiet gathering at the Guildhall one late morning, the hall empty, save for the key participants, Mrs. Purdy, Mr. Frampton, Mr. Danvers, and the curator, Miss Aldridge. The portrait hung behind them, serene and composed, its borrowed eyes catching the diffused sunlight streaming through the tall windows. There was no fanfare, no dramatic announcement. Flaxborough's truths, Purbright knew, were revealed in calm observation rather than theatrics. "Thank you all for attending," he began, his tone gentle but precise. "We have spent days observing, conversing, and considering minor irregularities. The events surrounding this exhibition, the missing sketch, the subtle gestures, and the whispers of concern have been telling in ways not immediately apparent." He paused, letting his words settle, allowing the stillness to focus attention. "The sketch was not stolen in malice, nor taken by accident," he continued. "It was borrowed by Mr. Danvers, who wished to examine the composition privately, fearing that certain elements might inadvertently reflect upon the reputations of those involved. His intentions were cautious, though in doing so, he created the appearance of irregularity and raised curiosity among the town's observers." Danvers inclined his head, lips pressed firmly, acknowledging the gentle rebuke embedded in Purbright's phrasing. The councillor's composure remained, yet the relief of clarity softened the tension in his shoulders. Purbright then addressed the portrait itself, and the peculiar impression you all noticed, the sense that Mrs. Purdy's eyes were borrowed or different, arises from Mr. Frampton's choice to combine study of expression with subtle, imaginative liberty. There is no impropriety, merely an artist exercising his careful observation and creativity, capturing character rather than mere likeness. Frampton's fingers twitched with restrained pride, while Mrs. Purdy's hands rested lightly on the back of a chair, her composure restored, though tinged with residual amusement. The tension that had lingered for days dissipated gently, replaced by polite understanding and quiet smiles. Purbright concluded, his gaze encompassing the small assembly. The town's intrigue, though amplified by gossip and subtle observation, has revealed the patterns of human behavior most clearly. Small gestures, minor irregularities, and brief hesitations are more revealing than direct confession. In this case, they have guided us to a resolution that is both orderly and unremarkable, yet instructive in its subtlety. As the group dispersed, the Guildhall returned to its ordinary calm. Residents resumed their routines, the whispered conversations gradually losing the sharp edge of speculation. Mrs. Purdy continued her floral arrangements with renewed ease, and Frampton busied himself with new canvases, still alert but less self-conscious. Mr. Danvers returned to council duties, the minor stir now reduced to polite memory, and the curator carefully restored the exhibition space to its habitual order. Purbright, alone in his office once more, allowed himself a moment of reflection. The threads of observation, the careful accumulation of human nuance, had produced clarity without disturbance. Flaxborough, in its quiet way, returned to normalcy, though subtle shifts in awareness lingered, a testament to the insights quietly gained. He made a brief note in his journal, then set aside his pen, satisfied that the delicate equilibrium of human observation and polite resolution had been maintained.